Hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's story. Your likes and subscriptions can give me hope to create better stories, and let me know what changes you'd like me to make to my voice. Alright, now let's get to tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Forest's Gentle Keeper. In a forest where the trees whispered ancient secrets to the wind, there lived an old woman whose name had long been forgotten by the world, but never by the woodland creatures, who called her simply the Weaver. Her cottage stood in a clearing where the morning light fell like honey through the canopy, and where the evening mist gathered soft as lamb's wool around the weathered stone walls. The cottage itself seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Its walls were made of smooth river stones that had been polished by of patient hands and loving care. Climbing roses, their blooms now turned to scarlet hips, embraced the walls in a gentle hold, while morning glories twisted up wooden posts, their trumpet flowers opening each dawn to greet the sun. Inside, the cottage was warm and welcoming, filled with the soft light that filtered through windows made of old, slightly wavy glass that cast dancing rainbows on the wooden floors. The floors themselves were wide planks of oak that had darkened with age to the colour of rich tea, worn but it was in the main room where the true magic happened. For this was where the Weaver practiced her gentle art. Against one wall stood an enormous cabinet made of cherry wood, its many small drawers carefully labelled in her flowing script. Each drawer contained leaves, but not ordinary leaves. These were leaves that had been gathered at the perfect moment of their autumn glory, when they held within their fibres all the stories of the growing season, all the secrets whispered by the wind, and all the dreams of the tree that had given them life. In the drawer, marked Maple Sunset Orange, were leaves that glowed like tiny flames, each one perfectly preserved and soft as silk. The drawer labelled Oak Ancient Gold held leaves the colour of treasure, thick and sturdy, ready to become the warmest of garments. Birch Butter Yellow contained delicate leaves that seemed to hold captured sunlight, while Sweet Gum Royal Purple treasured leaves that shimmered with the deep colour of twilight skies. The Weaver's work table sat beneath the largest window, where she could watch the forest while she worked. The table was made from a single slice of an ancient elm tree, its rings telling the story of hundreds of seasons. Upon this table lay her tools, scissors so sharp they could cut a whisper, needles that seemed to be made of moonbeams, and thread spun from the finest spider silk and morning dew. But her most precious tool was a small wooden thimble, carved from heartwood and worn smooth by decades of use, that had been given to her by the forest itself on the day she first understood her calling. The Weaver was not young, though no one could say exactly how old she was. Her hair was silver white like fresh snow, braided with small wooden beads that clicked softly when she moved. Her eyes were the warm brown of tree bark, kind and gentle, with little crinkles at the corners from years of smiling at the small joys of forest life. Her hands, though lined with age, moved with the grace and certainty of someone who had found their true purpose in life. She wore simple clothes, a dress the colour of forest loam, an apron embroidered with tiny leaves, and soft leather shoes that made no sound as she walked through the woodland. Every morning, As the first light began to paint the sky pale rose and gold, the weaver would wake to the sound of her forest friends gathering outside her cottage. They came not with words, for animals and humans do not share the same language, but with a feeling, a warm presence that seemed to say, "We are here. We trust you. We know you will help us prepare." First to arrive were usually the squirrels, busy, bright-eyed creatures with tails like feather dusters and paws that never seemed to stop moving. They would perch on her windowsill, their heads tilted to one side as they watched her begin her morning routine. The weaver would greet each one with a gentle nod, noting which ones had grown since last she saw them, which ones looked thin and needed extra warmth, and which ones were expecting little ones that would need their own special coats. Next came the rabbits, soft and brown and grey, hopping quietly across the clearing to sit in companionable silence near her door. Their noses would twitch constantly, taking in the comforting scents of her cottage, the dried herbs, the old wood, the special preparations she made for treating the leaves. Some rabbits were bold and would venture close to her feet, while others remained shy, keeping to the edges of the clearing, but watching with bright, trusting eyes. The mice arrived in small groups, tiny creatures with quick movements and quicker hearts. But they had learned over the years that the weaver's cottage was a place of safety and warmth. They would gather beneath the great oak tree that shaded her garden, grooming their whiskers and preening their small, neat coats while they waited for their turn to be measured and fitted. As the morning progressed, larger animals would make their appearance. A family of raccoons might emerge from the hollow tree where they made their home, their masked faces giving them an air of gentle mischief, their hands so clever and human-like that the weaver often marvelled at their dexterity. Sometimes a young deer would step delicately into the clearing, all long legs and large eyes, moving with the grace that only wild things possess. And then there were the special visitors, the animals that came only occasionally, but were always welcome. An old badger who moved slowly but with great dignity, his grey coat speaking of many winters survived and wisdom earned. A family of otters from the stream that ran through the heart of the forest, sleek and playful even in their preparation for winter's rest. Once, memorably, a great owl had arrived just as the sun was setting, her enormous eyes blinking slowly in what the weaver had recognized as a gesture of respect. Each animal that came to her clearing had its own needs, its own story, its own preparations to make for the long winter ahead. And the weaver, with her patient hands and generous heart, was ready to help them all. She would begin each day by stepping out onto her small front porch, breathing in the cool morning air that carried with it the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke from her own chimney. The forest would greet her with its morning sounds, the rustle of creatures beginning their daily routines, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant. And so it was that each autumn morning began in the forest clearing, with the weaver standing ready to practice her gentle art, surrounded by the creatures who had learned to trust in her skill and love, for they all understood, in the wordless way that forest dwellers do, that winter was coming, and that preparation made with care and love was the key to emerging safely into the spring. The autumn air in the forest held a special quality, crisp and clean, with just the hint of wood smoke and the earthy scent of leaves beginning their transformation from green to gold. It was air that seemed to carry promises, the promise of cozy evenings by warm fires, of peaceful sleep through the cold months, of dreams filled with memories of summer sunshine and the anticipation of spring's return. As the weaver moved through her morning routine, she could feel the forest settling into its rhythm of preparation. Squirrels were gathering their final stores of nuts and seeds, tucking them away in secret places for the lean months ahead. Birds were fluffing their feathers and finding the most sheltered spots for roosting. Even the trees themselves seemed to be drawing their energy inward, preparing for the long, quiet rest that winter would bring. But of all the preparations being made throughout the forest, none were more important or more lovingly crafted than the special coats that the weaver created for her animal friends. For these were not ordinary garments. They were coats woven with stories, stitched with dreams, and blessed with all the warmth and protection that a generous heart could provide. Each coat began with the selection of leaves, and this was perhaps the most important part of the weaver's work. She could not simply gather any fallen leaf. Each one had to be chosen with care, at exactly the right moment in its journey from green to gold. The leaves had to be perfect, unblemished by insects or disease, fully transformed in colour, and still holding within their fibres all the life and energy that would make them suitable for her special purpose. The weaver had learned through decades of practice to read the signs that told her when a leaf was ready for harvest. There was a certain quality to the light that passed through it, a particular way it moved in the breeze, a subtle change in texture that spoke to her experienced hands. She would walk through the forest in the early morning hours, when the dew still clung to every surface and the world seemed hushed and waiting. When she found a perfect leaf, she would approach it with the reverence of someone who understood that she was being granted a gift. She would place her hand gently on the trunk of the tree, feeling the slow, deep pulse of its life, and silently ask permission to take what she needed. Then, with scissors that were sharp enough to cut cleanly, but gentle enough to cause no harm, she would carefully remove the leaf from its branch. Each leaf was then carried back to her cottage in a special basket lined with soft moss, where it would be prepared for its transformation into part of a coat. The preparation process was as important as the sewing itself, for it was during this time that the weaver would whisper to each leaf the stories it would carry, the dreams it would hold, and the protection it would provide. Some leaves were destined to become the outer layers of coats. These were usually the larger, sturdier leaves that could provide protection from wind and rain. Others, smaller and more delicate, would become the soft inner linings that would hold warmth close to the animal's body. Still others, the most beautiful and perfect specimens, would become decorative elements, collars and cuffs and tiny buttons that would make each coat not just functional, but beautiful as well. The thread that the weaver used was as special as the leaves themselves. She spun it from various materials gathered throughout the forest. Spider silk collected from abandoned webs, always with the spider's permission. fibers from milkweed pods, and the soft undercoat shed by rabbits and deer in the spring. These materials were twisted together with drops of morning dew and a whispered blessing. But perhaps the most magical aspect of the weaver's work was the stories that she wove into each coat. These were not stories told with words, but stories held in the memory of the leaves themselves, stories drawn from the deep wisdom of the forest, and stories born from the weaver's own long experience of living in harmony with the natural world. A coat made from oak leaves might carry the story of strength and endurance, helping a small animal feel brave and steady during the long winter months. A coat fashioned from birch leaves would hold stories of flexibility and grace, reminding its wearer to bend without breaking when the winter winds grew strong. Maple leaves brought stories of sweetness and transformation, while pine needles woven into the lining would carry the fresh, clean scent of evergreen hope. Each story was chosen specifically for the animal who would wear the coat. The weaver had learned to read the needs of her forest friends, to understand what kind of comfort and strength each one would need to carry them through the winter. A young squirrel experiencing its first winter might need a coat filled with stories of courage and adventure, while an old badger might benefit from tales of wisdom and the satisfaction of a life well lived. As the morning light grew stronger and the forest began to wake fully to the new day, the weaver would complete her own preparations for the day's work. She would brew a pot of tea made from herbs she had grown in her garden, chamomile for peace, mint for clarity, and a touch of honey gathered from the wild bees who made their home in the ancient oak tree at the edge of her clearing. With her tea steaming gently in a cup made from polished burl wood, she would settle at her work table and begin to plan the day's sewing. Spread before her would be her record book, its pages filled with careful notes about each animal who had come to her for help. Here she recorded measurements and preferences, special needs, and particular stories that each animal might benefit from carrying. Mrs. Rabbit, she might read, medium size. 3 young ones to prepare for winter, nervous about first snow, needs coat with stories of safe burrows and warm families. Or young squirrel, very active, sometimes forgets to eat when playing. Coat should include reminders about the importance of winter preparations and the joy of sharing with friends. As she planned and prepared, the weaver could hear the gentle sounds of her animal friends beginning to gather outside. They came quietly, respectfully, understanding somehow that the morning hours were when she prepared herself for the day's work. They would settle in their accustomed places, the squirrels on the windowsill, the rabbits near the garden gate, the mice beneath the oak tree, and wait patiently for her to emerge and begin the day's fittings and sewings. And when she finally rose from her work table and moved toward the door, her heart would fill with the same gentle joy that had sustained her through all the years of her calling. For she knew that today, as every day during the autumn season, she would have the privilege of helping her forest friends prepare for winter with warmth, comfort, and the kind of love that could only be stitched into a coat made from golden leaves and woven dreams. The door would open with a soft creak of well-oiled hinges, and the weaver would step out into the clearing where her friends waited. The real work of the day was about to begin, and both she and the animals could feel the anticipation in the air, the excitement of transformation, the comfort of preparation, and the deep peace that comes from knowing that winter, when it arrived, would find them all ready and warm. Chapter 2. The Art of Autumn Sowing. The morning sun climbed higher through the canopy, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the weaver's clearing as she began the day's work in earnest. This was the time she treasured most, when the forest was fully awake, but still wrapped in the peaceful quiet that comes before the day's activities truly begin. The air was crisp enough to make her breath visible in small puffs, but not so cold as to make working with the delicate leaves difficult. The first customer of the day was almost always Nutkin, a grey squirrel who had been coming to the weaver for coats for nearly 7 seasons now. He was a practical sort of squirrel, more interested in warmth and durability than in fashion. But the weaver had learned over the years that even practical Nutkin appreciated a touch of beauty in his winter wear. Nutkin approached her work table with his characteristic, quick, nervous movements, his tail twitching with barely contained energy. He had grown larger since his last fitting, as squirrels do when they begin their serious preparations for winter, building up the layer of fat that would help sustain them through the coldest months. "Good morning, Nutkin," the weaver said softly, her voice carrying the warm affection of long friendship. "I see you've been eating well. Shall we see about a new coat for this winter?" Nutkin chittered softly in response, sitting up on his haunches in the way that squirrels do when they want to appear dignified and important. The weaver reached for her measuring tape, a long strip of braided grass that she had woven herself many years ago, and began the careful process of taking Nutkin's measurements. "Around the chest," she murmured, making mental notes that she would record in her book later. "Length from neck to tail. Sleeve length for those busy arms of yours." Nutkin held still with remarkable patience for a squirrel, understanding from experience that this process, while sometimes tedious, was necessary for a coat that would fit properly and keep him truly warm. While she measured, the weaver found herself remembering all the coats she had made for Nutkin over the years. His first coat, when he was just a young squirrel, had been made from the golden yellow leaves of a tulip tree, soft and flexible enough for his energetic lifestyle, but warm enough to see him through his first winter. The stories woven into that coat had been tales of growing up, of learning to gather food and find the best places to hide it, and of the importance of paying attention to the changing seasons. His second coat had been crafted from the rich red leaves of a sugar maple, chosen because Nutkin had shown a particular fondness for maple seeds that year, and the weaver had thought it fitting that his coat should reflect his tastes. That coat had carried stories of abundance and the satisfaction of hard work. For it had been the year that Nutkin had first taken responsibility for helping some of the younger squirrels learn the art of winter preparation. Now, as she took his measurements for what would be his 8th winter coat, the weaver found herself planning something special. This year's coat would be made primarily from oak leaves, sturdy, dependable oak leaves in shades of bronze and copper that would complement Nutkin's grey fur beautifully. But she was thinking of adding some accents of golden birch leaves around the collar and cuffs, and perhaps a lining made from the soft, silvery leaves of lamb's ear that grew in her garden. "This year, my dear friend," she told Nutkin as she finished her measurements, "I think your coat will tell stories of leadership and community. You've become something of an elder squirrel, haven't you? The young ones look to you for guidance about winter preparation." Nutkin seemed to understand, sitting up a little straighter and preening his whiskers with pride. The weaver made her final notes about his measurements and then gently shooed him away from the work table. "Come back this afternoon," she told him. "Your coat will be ready for its first fitting then." As Nutkin scampered away to continue his daily rounds of the forest, the weaver turned her attention to her next customer. A family of field mice who had approached while she was working with Nutkin. The mouse family consisted of 2 parents and 3 young ones, and they huddled together in the way that small creatures do when they're both excited and nervous about something new. Mice, the weaver had learned over the years, required a different approach than squirrels. They were much smaller, of course, which meant their coats had to be made from the most delicate leaves she could find. But they were also more social creatures, taking comfort in being dressed similarly to their family members. So rather than making each mouse a completely individual coat, she would create a collection of related garments that would help the family feel united and coordinated. The parent mice were brown and grey, with bright black eyes and whiskers that never seemed to stop twitching. The young ones were smaller versions of their parents, but with the slightly awkward proportions of children who hadn't quite grown into themselves yet. All 5 mice watched the weaver with careful attention as she selected her measuring tools and began the delicate process of fitting them for their winter coats. "Now then," she said gently, kneeling down so she would be closer to their level, "who would like to go first?" The smallest mouse, barely more than a baby, was pushed forward by its siblings. The weaver could see that it was trembling slightly. Whether from cold or nervousness, she couldn't be sure, so she took extra care to move slowly and speak in her softest, most reassuring voice. "There's nothing to worry about, little one," she murmured, carefully placing her smallest measuring tape around the mouse's tiny chest. "We're just going to make sure your coat fits perfectly, so you'll be warm and comfortable all winter long." As she worked, taking measurements that were so small they seemed almost impossibly delicate, the weaver found herself thinking about the leaves she would use for the mouse family's coats. They would need to be small leaves, but also soft and warm. Perhaps the tiny leaves from the wild strawberry plants that grew along the stream bank, or the delicate leaves from the herb garden that were just the right size for such small customers. The coats for the mouse family would carry stories of togetherness and the comfort of family, she decided. Stories about the importance of staying close to loved ones during difficult times, and the way that sharing burdens makes them lighter for everyone. The parent mice would have slightly different stories woven into their coats, stories about the responsibility of caring for others and the deep satisfaction that comes from keeping one's family safe and warm. After she had measured all 5 mice and made careful notes about their needs and preferences, the weaver turned to the selection of leaves that would become their winter wardrobes. The mouse family waited patiently while she considered various options, occasionally conferring among themselves in the quick, quiet way that mice have of communicating. From one of her smaller drawers, the weaver withdrew a collection of leaves that she had been saving for just such a purpose. These were leaves from wild strawberry plants, tiny, heart-shaped leaves in shades of deep red and golden yellow that would be perfect for the mouse family's coats. They were soft enough not to chafe against the mice's delicate skin, but sturdy enough to provide real warmth and protection. But as she examined the strawberry leaves more closely, the weaver realized that she would need something additional for the lining of the coats. Mouse fur was fine and soft, but not particularly thick, and the winter ahead promised to be a cold one. She needed something that would add an extra layer of insulation, without adding too much bulk to the tiny garments. Her solution came from an unexpected source: the soft, downy seeds from milkweed pods that she had collected earlier in the season. These seeds with their silky white fluff. As she began the careful process of preparing the strawberry leaves for sewing, the weaver found her mind drifting to the stories she would weave into each coat. The mouse family had been coming to her clearing for 3 seasons now, and she had watched the young ones grow from tiny babies into capable young mice who were beginning to help with their family's winter preparations. The stories in the parents' names. Coats would speak of the deep roots that connect family members to each other, drawing on the ancient wisdom of trees that know how to support and nourish each other through their connected root systems. The young mice coats would carry tales of adventure and exploration, but always with the underlying message that home and family are the safe harbors to which one can always return. The process of actually sewing the coats was one that required not just technical skill, but a kind of meditative focus that allowed the weaver to pour her intentions and stories into every stitch. She would begin by laying out the leaves in the pattern that would become the coat, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle until she found the combination that looked and felt exactly right. For Nutkin's coat, she spread the bronze and copper oak leaves across her work table in overlapping layers, each leaf carefully positioned to create the most effective barrier against wind and cold. The golden birch leaves that would form the collar were arranged in a perfect circle, their pointed tips creating a decorative edge that would also help turn away rain and snow. The stitching itself was done with thread so fine it was almost invisible, each stitch placed with the precision that comes from decades of practice. As her needle moved through the leaves, joining them together in patterns that would become sleeves and bodies and hoods, the weaver would whisper the stories that each stitch was meant. The stories woven into each coat were drawn from many sources. Some came from the weaver's own long experience of living in harmony with the forest and its seasons. Others were borrowed from the deep memory of the trees themselves, stories that had been passed down through generations of oak and maple and birch. Stories about survival and renewal, and the eternal cycle of seasons. Still others were stories that the weaver had learned from the animals themselves. Observations about their behavior and needs that had taught her valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation. She had learned about persistence from watching squirrels bury hundreds of nuts each autumn, knowing that they would need to remember the location of each cache when winter came. She had learned about patience from watching badgers dig their deep, warm burrows, working steadily day after day until their winter homes were perfectly prepared. Each coat also carried within its fibres something of the specific tree from which its leaves had been gathered. An oak tree's story might speak of standing firm against storms, of providing shelter for countless creatures over the decades of its life, of the deep satisfaction that comes from fulfilling one's purpose season after season. A maple tree's story would tell of transformation and beauty, of the way that letting go of one thing, green leaves, could lead to something even more beautiful, the brilliant colours of autumn. As the hours passed and the sun climbed toward its zenith, the weaver's clearing became busier with animal visitors, but never chaotic. The creatures of the forest had learned over the years to be patient and respectful, understanding that good work takes time and that their turn would come. They found comfortable places to wait, sunning themselves on warm rocks, grooming their fur in preparation for their fittings, or simply resting quietly in the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to surround the weaver's cottage like a protective bubble. Some of the animals would doze while they waited, lulled by the gentle sounds of the weaver's work, the soft whisper of thread being drawn through leaves, the quiet rustle of fabric being arranged and rearranged, and her occasional murmured comments to herself as she solved some small problem of fit or design. The rabbits, in particular, seemed to find the atmosphere of the clearing deeply relaxing. They would settle themselves in comfortable positions and let their eyes drift closed, their breathing becoming deep and regular as they entered the light, restful state that comes just before true sleep. The weaver often paused in her work to watch them, thinking about how perfectly they embodied the peace and rest that she hoped to help all her animal friends achieve during the long winter months ahead. By midday, the weaver had completed Nutkin's coat and was ready for his first fitting. She called to him softly, and he bounded across the clearing with his characteristic energy, clearly eager to see what she had created for him. The coat, when she held it up for his inspection, was everything she had hoped it would be. Sturdy and practical, but also beautiful in the way that truly well-made things always are. The oak leaves had been joined so skillfully that the coat looked almost like a single, perfect leaf that had been shaped to fit a squirrel's body. The golden birch collar caught the midday light and seemed to glow with its own inner fire, while the soft lining made from lamb's ear leaves promised warmth and comfort against Nutkin's fur. "What do you think?" the weaver asked as she helped Nutkin into the coat, adjusting the fit around his shoulders and ensuring that his arms could move freely. "Does it feel comfortable? Can you move the way you need to?" Nutkin chittered his approval and performed a series of quick movements to test the coat's flexibility. Reaching up as if to grab a high branch, scampering forward a few steps, and turning his head to look behind him. The coat moved with him perfectly, providing protection without restricting his natural grace and agility. But the weaver could see that there was more than just physical comfort in Nutkin's response to his new coat. There was something in his posture, a kind of quiet confidence that suggested he could feel the stories that had been woven into the garment. He stood a little straighter, moved with a little more dignity, and when he looked at the weaver, there was gratitude and understanding in his bright eyes. It carries stories of leadership, the weaver reminded him gently. Stories about the importance of looking out for the younger squirrels and the satisfaction that comes from sharing your knowledge and experience. Wear it well, dear friend. Nutkin seemed to nod his understanding before bounding away to show his new coat to the other animals in the clearing. As he moved among them, the weaver could see the other creatures responding to something about him. Perhaps it was simply that he looked warmer and more prepared for winter. Or perhaps they could sense, in the mysterious way that animals do, the stories of leadership and community that his coat carried. The afternoon hours brought a steady stream of fittings and adjustments as the weaver worked to ensure that each coat was perfectly suited to its intended wearer. The mouse family's coats were completed and fitted, each tiny garment a masterpiece of miniature tailoring that would keep the small creatures warm through even the coldest nights. The young rabbits overcame their initial nervousness and submitted to their measurements with growing enthusiasm as they began to understand what wonderful gifts they would be receiving. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber that perfectly matched many of the coats she had created, the weaver felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a day of meaningful work well done. Around her, animals wearing their new coats moved about the clearing, testing the fit and feel of their winter garments, and the sight filled her heart with joy. Tomorrow, there would be more animals to fit, more coats to sew, more stories to weave into the fabric of winter preparation. But for now, as the day's work drew toward its close, the weaver allowed herself a moment to simply appreciate the beauty of the scene before her. A clearing full of creatures made ready for winter, each one carrying within their coat the stories and love that would help them not just survive the cold months ahead, but truly rest and renew themselves for the spring that would surely come. Chapter 3. Stories Sewn in Silk and Starlight. As autumn deepened and the nights grew longer, the weaver's work took on an even more magical quality. This was the time when she created her most special coats, garments that were not just for warmth and protection, but for carrying the deepest dreams of winter sleep. These were the coats worn by creatures who would spend the coldest months in true hibernation. And they needed to hold within their fibers all the stories that would sustain and comfort their wearers through the long, dark season of rest. The evening hours had become the weaver's favorite time for this most delicate work. As the sun set beyond the forest canopy and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she would light the oil lamps in her cottage and settle at her work table to work by their gentle golden glow. The lamplight seemed to make the autumn leaves she worked with even more beautiful, bringing out depths of colour and texture that daylight somehow missed. Tonight, she was working on a very special commission, a coat for Old Bear, the ancient creature who made his home in a cave deep in the forest's heart. Old Bear had been coming to the weaver for winter coats longer than any other animal, and each year his coat became more important as age made it harder for him to maintain his body temperature during the long months of hibernation. This year's coat would be her masterpiece of the season, a garment made from leaves she had been collecting and preparing for months, leaves that held within them the very essence of the forest's wisdom and strength. The outer shell would be crafted from the largest, and most perfect oak leaves she had ever found. Leaves that had turned not the usual brown or bronze, but a deep, rich gold that seemed to hold captured sunlight. These leaves had come from the great oak, the ancient tree that stood at the very center of the forest, and was said to be older than memory itself. For the lining, she had chosen something extraordinary. Leaves from the silver maple that grew beside the forest's hidden spring. Leaves that had turned not yellow or orange, but a soft, luminous silver that seemed to glow with moonlight. These leaves were said to hold the memory of every story ever told beneath their branches, every wish ever whispered to the wind, every dream ever dreamed by a creature seeking the comfort of their shade. But the most special element of Old Bear's coat would be the thread used to sew it together. This was thread that the weaver had been preparing since the previous spring. Thread spun not just from spider silk and plant fibers, but from materials that could only be gathered at the most magical moments of the year. There were strands drawn from the gossamer webs that appeared on dewy mornings. So delicate they seemed to be made of crystallized air. There were fibers from the seed pods of wishes, those dandelion puffs that carry dreams on the wind when children blow them into the sky. Most precious of all were the threads that came from starlight itself. Or at least, that's what the weaver called the silvery strands she found on certain clear nights, draped across branches like nature's own embroidery floss. Scientists might call it something else, but the weaver knew that these threads appeared only when the stars were particularly bright, and that garments sewn with them carried a special kind of magic. As she began the careful process of joining the golden oak leaves with her special thread, the weaver found herself remembering all the years she had known Old Bear. He had been ancient even when she first arrived in the forest, a creature of such dignity and wisdom that even the other animals seemed to recognize his special status. His coat was always the most challenging to create, not because he was difficult to please, but because the responsibility of keeping him warm through his long hibernation was one that the weaver felt deeply. Old Bear's hibernation was not like the lighter sleep of squirrels or rabbits, who might wake periodically during the winter to check their food stores or venture out on unusually warm days. Old Bear entered a sleep so deep that it was almost like a temporary death, a state of suspended animation that would last from the first hard frost until the spring peepers began their chorus in the warming earth. During all those months, his coat would be his only protection, the barrier between life and the creeping cold that could steal the warmth from even the largest and strongest of creatures. The stories that the weaver wove into Old Bear's coat were therefore the most important ones she told all year. These had to be stories with the power to sustain life itself, tales that could burn like small fires in the darkness of deep sleep, keeping the spark of awareness alive even when consciousness had fled to whatever place creatures go during the long winter rest. She began with stories of the great oak itself, drawing from the ancient tree's memory of countless seasons. The oak had stood in the forest for over 300 years, and in its rings were recorded the stories of droughts and floods, hard winters and gentle ones, years of plenty and years when food was scarce. But through all these cycles, The oak had endured, its deep roots finding water even in the driest summers, its thick bark protecting the life within from the harshest cold. "Remember," the weaver whispered to the golden leaves as she joined them with stitches made of starlight thread. "Remember how the oak stands firm against every storm. Remember the strength that comes from deep roots and the patience to wait for spring's return." Into the silver lining went different stories, softer tales drawn from the maple tree's memory of providing comfort and shelter. This tree had been the gathering place for countless forest councils, its broad canopy offering shade in summer, and its bare branches providing perches for winter birds. The silver maple knew stories of community and mutual support, of the way different species could help each other through difficult times. "Rest easy," she murmured as she worked the silver leaves into their perfect arrangement, knowing that you are part of a community that watches over its own. Sleep deeply, knowing that you are loved and valued, and that spring will bring you back to those who care for you. But perhaps the most important stories in Old Bear's coat were the ones that came from the weaver's own experience of the forest's cycles. She had lived in the clearing for more years than she could easily count, and she had seen how winter was not just an ending, but also a beginning, a time when the forest gathered its strength for the explosion of life that would come with spring. She wove into the coat memories of springs past, the day when the first snowdrops pushed through the last patches of snow, their delicate white flowers like drops of courage. "All of this is waiting for you," the weaver told the coat as she worked, her needle moving in the steady rhythm that came from decades of practice. "All the beauty of spring, all the warmth of summer, all the abundance of next autumn, it's all there, waiting for you to wake up and enjoy it again." As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter overhead, the weaver found herself working with a kind of meditative focus that seemed to connect her directly to the rhythms of the forest itself. Her breathing slowed to match the deep, patient breathing of trees at rest. Her heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the quiet pulse of life that continued even in the seeming stillness of approaching winter. The cottage around her was filled with the soft sounds of her work, the whisper of thread being drawn through leaves, the gentle rustle of fabric being arranged and rearranged, the soft scratching of her needle against her wooden thimble. Outside, the forest was settling into its own nighttime rhythm, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant call of a night bird to break the peaceful silence. When Old Bear's coat was finally complete, the weaver held it up to examine her work in the lamplight. It was, without question, the most beautiful. But more than its beauty, the weaver could feel the power in the coat, the strength of all the stories that had been woven into its fabric, the warmth of all the love and care that had gone into its creation. This was a coat that would not just keep Old Bear warm during his hibernation. It would keep him connected to life itself, ensuring that when spring arrived, he would wake refreshed and renewed, ready for another season of enjoying the forest's gifts. The next morning, Old Bear arrived for his fitting, just as the sun was beginning to paint the eastern sky with the first hints of dawn. He moved with the deliberate slowness of a creature whose body was already beginning to prepare for the long sleep ahead, but his eyes were still bright and alert, still full of the wisdom and humour that the weaver had always admired in him. "Good morning, old friend," she said softly, rising from her work table, where she had been making final adjustments to his coat. "I think this year's garment may be the finest I've ever made. Would you like to try it on?" Old Bear nodded his great head and sat back on his haunches, allowing the weaver to help him into the coat. It fit perfectly, of course. Her measurements were always exact. But more than that, it seemed to transform him. The golden leaves caught the morning light and made him appear to be clothed in sunshine itself, while the silver lining provided a soft contrast that brought out the natural beauty of his thick, dark fur. As the coat settled around his shoulders, the weaver could see Old Bear's expression change. His eyes grew distant and peaceful, as if he could already feel the stories that lived within the garment beginning to work their gentle magic. His breathing deepened and slowed, and when he looked at the weaver, there was something in his gaze that spoke of gratitude deeper than words could express. It carries the memory of every spring that has ever come to the forest. The weaver told him quietly, and the promise that spring will come again, no matter how long or cold the winter may seem. Rest well, dear friend. Dream of warm sunshine and flowing water, of flowers blooming and birds singing. All of it is waiting for you. Old Bear stood slowly and moved toward the edge of the clearing. But before disappearing into the forest, he turned back to look at the weaver one more time. In that look was everything he could not say. His trust in her skill, his gratitude for her care, his confidence that the coat she had made would see him safely through to spring. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows beneath the trees like a golden dream returning to the realm of sleep. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, more animals came to the weaver for their hibernation coats. There was Mrs. Woodchuck, who needed a coat that would keep her warm in her deep burrow, while also allowing her to move easily in the confined space. The weaver created for her a garment of soft brown leaves from the beech tree, leaves that held stories of the rich, dark earth and the safety of underground places. There was a family of chipmunks who would spend the winter in semi-hibernation, waking occasionally to eat from their carefully stored supplies. Their coats were made from the striped leaves of tulip poplars, leaves that naturally bore bands of yellow and green that perfectly complemented the chipmunk's own striped fur. The stories woven into these coats spoke of preparation and foresight, of the satisfaction that comes from hard work and careful planning. Most challenging of all was the coat requested by Luna, a flying squirrel who needed a garment that would accommodate her gliding membranes while still providing warmth during her periods of winter torpor. The weaver solved this problem by creating a coat with specially designed openings that allowed Luna's wing membranes to extend freely, while keeping the rest of her body perfectly protected. The coat was made from the most delicate leaves she could find, tiny leaves from wild cherry trees that had turned a soft pink in the autumn air, leaves that seemed to float rather than fall when the wind touched them. Luna's coat carried stories of flight and freedom, tales of seeing the forest from above and understanding how all its parts connected to create a single living whole. But it also held stories of coming home, of the comfort of returning to one's own safe place after adventures in the wider world. Each hibernation coat was unique, tailored not just to the physical needs of its wearer, but to their individual dreams and fears about the long sleep ahead. Some animals approached hibernation with eager anticipation, ready to rest after the busy months of preparation. Others felt anxious about surrendering consciousness for so many months, worried about what might happen while they slept. For these anxious creatures, the weaver would include special stories in their coats, tales of guardians who watched over sleeping animals, of the way the forest itself provided protection for those who trusted in its care. She would weave in memories of all the successful hibernations she had witnessed over the years, all the animals who had emerged healthy and happy when spring returned. "Sleep is not surrender," she would murmur as she worked on these coats. "Sleep is trust. Trust in the cycles of nature. Trust in the wisdom of your own body. Trust in the love that surrounds you, even when you're not awake to feel it." As the last hibernation coat was completed and delivered, the weaver felt a familiar sense of completion mixed with anticipation. The deep sleepers of the forest were now prepared for their long rest, each one carrying with them the stories and warmth they would need to see them through to spring. Soon they would disappear into their dens and burrows and hollow trees, beginning the great sleep that would carry them through the darkest months of the year. But the weaver's work was not finished. There were still the animals who would remain active throughout the winter. The deer and rabbits, the squirrels and mice, the birds who chose not to migrate south. These creatures would need different kinds of coats, garments designed not for hibernation, but for active survival in the cold months ahead. As she prepared for this next phase of her autumn work, the weaver found herself thinking about the different kinds of stories that would be needed for the winter active animals. These would be stories of endurance and resourcefulness, tales of finding food in the lean months and staying warm during the longest nights. They would be stories of community and cooperation, of the way animals could help each other survive when times were hard. But they would also be stories of hope and perseverance, reminders that even the darkest winter eventually gives way to spring. For while the hibernating animals would sleep through the worst of the cold season, those who remained active would need the strength to face each day of winter as it came, finding beauty and meaning even in the stark landscape of snow and bare branches. The forest was settling into its rhythm of winter preparation, and the weaver, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the love of her animal friends, was ready to help them all prepare for whatever the cold months might bring. In her cottage, lit by the warm glow of oil lamps and filled with the rich scents of autumn leaves and dried herbs, she would continue her patient work of creating garments that were so much more than simple coats. They were gifts of warmth and story, protection and love, woven together with threads of starlight and hope. Outside, the first frost was beginning to silver the grass in her clearing, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of winter's approach. But inside her cottage, surrounded by the materials of her craft and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. The weaver felt only warmth and peace. The forest was in good hands, her hands, and soon all its creatures would be ready for the season of rest and renewal that lay ahead. Chapter 4. The Circle of Seasons Complete. The first snow of winter arrived on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed to burn with particular brightness in the clear, cold sky. The weaver woke to a world transformed. Her familiar clearing now draped in a soft blanket of white that seemed to muffle all sound and create a sense of deep, peaceful hush that spoke of the season's true arrival. She rose early, as was her custom, and stepped out onto her porch to breathe in the crisp winter air. The snow was not deep, just enough to outline every branch and blade of grass with delicate white lace. But it carried with it the promise of more substantial snowfalls to come. Winter had arrived in earnest, and it was time for the final phase of her autumn work. The animals who would remain active during the winter months were already stirring in the pre-dawn darkness, beginning the daily routines that would sustain them through the cold season. The weaver could hear them moving through the forest, the soft crunch of footsteps in the new snow, the rustle of creatures searching for food, the occasional call of a bird announcing the new day to its neighbors. These were the animals for whom she would create her final collection of autumn coats, not the deep hibernation garments that would sustain sleepers through months of unconsciousness, but practical, everyday coats designed for creatures who would face winter day by day, finding warmth and food and shelter as needed. The first to arrive at her clearing that morning was Frost, a white rabbit whose pale fur made him almost invisible against the new snow. Frost was a practical sort of rabbit, more concerned with function than fashion. But the weaver had learned over the years that even the most practical animals appreciated a touch of beauty in their winter wear. "Good morning, Frost," she called softly, not wanting to startle him in the quiet morning air. "I see winter has found us at last. Are you ready for your winter coat?" Frost approached her workbench with the careful, alert manner that rabbits always maintained, even when they felt completely safe. His nose twitched constantly, taking in the scents of her cottage, the dried herbs, the prepared leaves, the special oils she used to treat the fabric of the coats she made. For Frost's coat, the weaver had selected leaves that would complement his natural colouring, while providing the camouflage he would need to stay safe during the winter months. The main body of the coat would be made from birch leaves that had turned a soft, pale yellow, almost white in certain lights that would help him blend with the snow-covered landscape. The lining would be created from the silvery undersides of poplar leaves, providing an extra layer of insulation while maintaining the light colour palette that would keep him inconspicuous. But the true beauty of Frost's coat lay in the subtle details the weaver had planned. Around the collar and cuffs, she would add tiny accents made from the delicate leaves of winter-blooming plants, leaves that carried within them the remarkable ability to stay green even in the coldest weather. These accents would not only add a touch of colour to the otherwise pale coat, but would carry stories of endurance and the ability to find life, even in the most challenging circumstances. As she worked on Frost's coat, taking careful measurements and making notes about his particular needs, the weaver found herself thinking about the stories that would be most helpful for a rabbit facing his first full winter as an adult. Rabbits were prey animals, always alert to danger, always ready to run. Their winter coats needed to carry stories that would help them stay calm and focused, even when the world around them seemed hostile and threatening. "This coat will tell you stories of survival," she murmured, as she began the delicate process of joining the birch leaves together. Stories of rabbits who have faced hard winters before you and emerged healthy and strong in the spring. It will remind you that you have everything you need within you. Speed when you need to run, stillness when you need to hide, and the wisdom to know the difference. The thread she used for Frost's coat was spun from the inner bark of basswood trees, combined with the finest rabbit fur that had been naturally shed during grooming. This created a thread that was not only strong and flexible, but that carried a scent familiar and comforting to rabbits, a subtle reminder of home and safety that would provide psychological as well as physical comfort. As she stitched, the weaver wove into the coat stories of the hidden places where rabbits could find shelter during winter storms. The hollow logs and dense thickets, the spaces beneath root systems, and the cozy nooks in rock formations. She included tales of winter foods that many rabbits overlooked: the nutritious bark of certain trees, the seeds that remained hidden beneath the snow, the dried berries that clung to bushes long after their leaves had fallen. But perhaps most importantly, she wove in stories of rabbit communities, the way that rabbits could help each other by sharing information about food sources and safe places, the importance of staying connected with other rabbits even when individual survival seemed to demand isolation. When Frost's coat was complete, the weaver helped him into it and was pleased to see how perfectly it fit his lean frame. The pale colours made him blend so seamlessly with the snowy clearing that he seemed to shimmer in and out of visibility like a creature made of winter light itself. But more than the camouflage, she could see that the coat gave him confidence. He stood straighter, moved with more assurance. And when he tested his ability to run and change direction quickly, the coat moved with him like a second skin. "Remember," she told him, as Frost seemed to understand, thumping his powerful hind foot once in what the weaver had learned was a rabbit's way of saying thank you. Then he bounded away across the snowy clearing, his new coat helping him move like a ghost through the winter landscape. The next customer of the day was a family of cardinals, the male brilliant red even against the snow, the female a more subtle brown and rust that was no less beautiful for its quiet elegance. Birds presented unique challenges for the weaver's coat-making skills, as their garments had to accommodate wings and flight while still providing protection from winter weather. The solution she had developed over the years was to create what she called flight capes, garments that covered a bird's back and breast while leaving the wings completely free for movement. These capes were made from the smallest, most delicate leaves she could find, and were sewn with thread so fine it was barely visible, even in bright sunlight. For the cardinal family, she had chosen leaves from wild cherry trees, leaves that in autumn had turned shades of red and orange that perfectly complemented both the male's brilliant plumage and the female's more subtle colouring. The leaves had been prepared with a special process that made them water-resistant while keeping them flexible, ensuring that the birds would stay dry, even in sleet or freezing rain. The stories woven into the cardinal capes spoke of faithfulness and partnership, drawing inspiration from the way cardinal pairs stayed together year-round, supporting each other through every season. The weaver included tales of birds who had successfully navigated harsh winters by working together, sharing the warmth of their bodies during the coldest nights, and taking turns standing guard while the other rested. She also wove in stories of hope and renewal, reminding the cardinals that their bright colours were like living flames that brought warmth and beauty to the grey landscape of winter. Their presence in the snowy forest would be a gift to all the other creatures who saw them, a reminder that life and colour and beauty persisted even in the darkest months of the year. As the morning progressed, more winter-active animals arrived for their fittings. There was a family of grey squirrels who needed coats that would allow them to remain active in the trees even when branches were slick with ice. The weaver created for them garments with specially textured surfaces that would provide extra grip, while the stories woven into the fabric reminded them to be extra cautious when navigating winter obstacles. A young deer came shyly to the edge of the clearing, her large eyes reflecting both curiosity and nervousness. Deer were among the most challenging customers, as they rarely stayed still long enough for proper fittings, and their coats had to accommodate their graceful but unpredictable movements. The weaver had learned to work quickly and efficiently with deer, taking rough measurements and then creating adjustable garments that could be fine-tuned as needed. The deer's coat was made from large maple leaves in shades of gold and brown that would help her blend with the winter forest, while the stories woven into the fabric spoke of the ancient paths that deer had travelled for generations, paths that would remain passable even when snow covered the more obvious routes. The coat also carried tales of the hidden clearings where deer could find shelter from winter storms, and the secret places where tender shoots continued to grow even in the cold season. As the sun climbed higher and the morning gave way to afternoon, the weaver found herself working with a steady rhythm that seemed to match the peaceful pace of the winter day. The snow continued to fall lightly, adding to the sense of quiet contemplation that had settled over the clearing. Her animal customers seemed affected by the weather as well, moving more slowly and deliberately, as if they too could feel the season calling them toward a deeper kind of rest and reflection. The afternoon brought some of her most regular customers, the mice and voles who would remain active throughout the winter, tunneling beneath the snow and creating an entire world of winter activity that was invisible to larger creatures. These tiny animals needed coats that were not just warm. For the mouse families, the weaver created coats from the smallest leaves she had ever worked, with tiny leaves from thyme and other ground-covering plants that grew in her herb garden. These leaves were naturally water-resistant and had a pleasant scent that would help mask the mice's natural odours from predators who might try to hunt them during the winter months. The stories woven into the mouse coats spoke of the vast underground networks that mice created during winter. Tunnels and chambers that connected family groups and allowed for the sharing of resources and warmth. The coats carried tales of cooperation and community, reminding the mice that survival was easier when everyone worked together for the common good. There was Old Bear's golden coat disappearing into the shadows as he made his way to his winter den, the garment seeming to glow with its own inner light, even in the fading daylight. There was Frost, barely visible against the snow, but moving with the easy confidence of a rabbit who knew he was well protected and perfectly camouflaged. There were the cardinals, their flight capes allowing them to dart and swoop through the winter air like tiny flames dancing against the grey sky. The sight filled the weaver's heart with deep satisfaction. This was why she did her work, not just to keep the forest animals warm and dry during the winter months, but to help them feel confident and cared for, to remind them that they were part of a community that looked out for its members, and to give them tangible proof that someone understood their needs and was willing to work tirelessly to meet them. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the weaver returned to her cottage to prepare for the quiet months ahead. Winter was her time for rest and reflection, for planning the coats she would create next autumn, and for maintaining the tools and materials that made her work possible. It was also her time for storytelling, for recording the tales she had woven into the year's coats, and for collecting new stories that she heard from the winter wind and the crackling of her fireplace. She lit her oil lamps and settled into her favourite chair beside the fire, a cup of herbal tea steaming gently in her hands. Around her, the cottage was filled with the comfortable remnants of her season's work. Scraps of beautiful leaves that had been too small to use, spools of thread in colours that captured every shade of autumn, and her record book filled with notes about each animal customer and their particular needs and preferences. But as she sat in the warm, golden light of her cottage, what filled the weaver's heart most completely was not the evidence of work accomplished, but the knowledge of love shared. Every coat she had created during the autumn season had been sewn not just with thread, but with care. Every story she had woven into the fabric had been chosen not just for its appropriateness, but for its power to comfort and sustain. Outside her windows, the forest was settling into its winter rhythm. The hibernating animals were already deep in their restful sleep, their coats keeping them warm and safe in their dens and burrows. The winter-active creatures were adapting to their new routines, their new coats helping them find confidence and security in the changed landscape of the cold season. And in her cottage at the heart of it all, the weaver sat peacefully beside her fire, knowing that her work had helped prepare the forest for another successful winter. Soon she too would settle into the slower pace of the cold months, but her dreams would be filled with plans for next year's coats and stories. As the weaver's eyes grew heavy and she prepared to seek her own rest, she could feel the contentment of the forest around her. The peaceful sleep of the hibernating animals, the confident activity of the winter-awake creatures, and the deep, patient rest of the trees themselves. All were ready for winter. All were prepared for spring. And all were held safe in the circle of seasons that would continue long after any individual creature had returned to the earth. The last thing the weaver saw before sleep took her was the gentle glow of firelight on the walls of her cottage, and the last thing she felt was gratitude. Gratitude for the privilege of doing work that mattered. Gratitude for the trust of the forest creatures who came to her for help. And gratitude for the endless cycle of seasons that brought new opportunities for service and new chances to share the gift of love made tangible in the form of coats sewn from golden leaves and starlight dreams. Outside, the snow fell steadily through the night, and the forest settled deeper into its winter peace, secure in the knowledge that it was loved, protected, and beautifully prepared for whatever the cold months might bring. The end.